Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to participants from around the world to this session on breaking silos across sectors and boundaries. My name is Sonja Koeppel. I'm working at UNECE, currently as Secretary of the Water Convention. Water and climate know no boundaries. Let's take an example of a transboundary basin in which an upstream country decides to take certain climate change measures, such as construction of certain infrastructures, dikes or dams. In addition, due to the need for energy production, and more specifically firewood, households are cutting trees. Populations downstream then may suffer from increased erosion and flood risks, and potentially even reduced water availability, which can become a significant problem during pandemics such as COVID-19. On top of that, climate change impacts leading to increased flow variability with higher floods and droughts further aggravate the situation. What to do in such situation? One option is that both countries and sectors on both sides develop their own adaptation measures. On the other hand, it would be much more effective, since by working together, if the countries work together and involve different sectors, the riparian countries can develop joint and basin-wide solutions to alleviate climate change impacts and reduce poverty, such as catchment management to control erosion through afforestation or wetland restoration, installation of renewable energy sources and energy trade, and many other measures. This example shows that working across sectors and boundaries is crucial to address different challenges and crises, including climate change. Such situation can happen in many basins around the world. 60% of all fresh water worldwide flows in shared basins, and more than 80% of water is used by other sectors, such as agriculture and energy. Nearly 10% of global energy generation is used for pumping, treating, and transporting water. These figures show the need for integrated solutions to address today's challenges. Such an integrated approach was enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. However, SDG 6 and other SDGs are lagging behind. We can only achieve them by cooperating across sectors and borders, as the recently launched SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework shows. Many organizations are now arguing for such integrated approaches. For example, the Water Convention, which I'm currently heading, a unique legal and intergovernmental framework for transboundary water cooperation, supports countries to adapt to climate change and to cooperate across borders. Examples are basin-wide adaptation strategies and measures developed in several basins, as well as intersectoral nexus assessments in more than 6 basins aimed to jointly identify intersectoral issues and to address them through concrete cross-sectoral and technical solutions at regional, basin, country, and local levels. In order to analyze challenges, propose solutions, and gather good practices, several organizations came together in preparation for World Water Week 2020 to discuss this topic further. These include SIWI, the International Water Management Institute, IWMI, the World Bank, and UNECE, the Secretariat of the Water Convention. Unfortunately, we cannot meet in person now in Stockholm, but we decided to still go forward and organize as a first step a webinar which discusses how climate change and water are inextricably linked across sectors and boundaries. We will have a number of important speakers today to introduce the topic and then a discussion. The first speaker setting the scene will be done by Martina Klimes from SIWI. Then, unfortunately, we had foreseen a civil society speaker, Ms. Hajar Sharif, co-founder of Together We Build, but unfortunately, due to different issues, she couldn't connect from Libya, so we will have to skip that presentation. Afterwards, we will hear transboundary perspective from Anoulak Kittikhoun from the Mekong River Commission, and then an intersectoral perspective from a representative of an international financial institution, Anders Jägerskog from the World Bank. But then we would really like to have an interactive debate with the audience, which will be moderated by Rachael McDonnell from the International Water Management Institute, IWMI. We encourage you all to be very active and we invite you to use the chat to introduce yourselves or to share information. And if you have any questions, you may use the Q&A for questions and answers, which will then be taken up during the discussion session. With this short introduction, I would like to hand over to the first speaker, Martina Klimes, Advisor for Water and Peace and Transboundary Cooperation at the Stockholm International Water Institute. Martina, go ahead.
Hello.
We cannot hear you.
Yes.
Now we can hear you, yes.
Thank you very much, Sonja. I would also like to welcome everyone. And my task is really to introduce the theme, introduce the topic. And I selected these 4 different sectors that should give us a good introduction and help us to think a little bit, what do we actually mean by breaking silos? It's a very general term, but here we have a little introduction to what should we imagine under that. First is that different sectors, as well as the different countries, they speak different languages. And so the question is, do we understand each other? How do we communicate? One very famous example is, for example, if a military person says, let's engage the person, that means let's start combat, let's start military operation. But if a diplomat would say, let's engage, that means let's start cooperation. So just by giving you this brief example, we really have to think that when working together across different sectors, we really need to think further beyond the language. We really need to think beyond position and interest. What is it that is really meant? We see that we have, everybody understands, for example, something different under the term resilience. We also have different perspectives of what, for example, no significant harm means, which is a concept that's often used in transboundary water cooperation. So first, we really need to think that we do have our jargons. We do speak different languages, even if we all speak English. So we really need to look beyond this. In the context of this, I would really like you to encourage to think about the one boundary. For some sectors, boundary means the border between national states. But for others, it could also mean boundaries between different entities on a subnational level. So for the purposes of this webinar, we really do not put any restrictions on the word boundary. We could really absolutely also apply this to subnational levels. The other issue that we need to look into are different actors. Every sector engages with different type of actors. And we see this as something very beneficial. Because while, for example, establishing and maintaining and nurturing relations between countries can be domain of just representatives of ministries of foreign affairs, we see that in water sector, it's also beneficial if we have other actors engaged because they have different perspectives, they have access to different knowledge networks, and they have a different situational awareness of a particular problem. The other thing is that, as we discussed during last year's World Water Week, we need to be more inclusive. We need to ensure that we have a equal representation of both genders, of all genders. We also need to have a good representation of youth. For example, in the Middle East, currently we are facing a significant problem with a very high youth unemployment. We see groups of youth who are very dissatisfied with the current situation. We need to learn how to listen to them. We need to include their perspectives in the issues that we are trying to solve. So including different sectors also helps us get access to different types of actors. And this, as I already mentioned, has also impact on the context and situational awareness. Different actors have access to different knowledge networks and can also evaluate different types of risks. That help us, when we have different levels of knowledge, find better ways how we can work together, because it helps us to understand better what are the risks that we all share. And something that was said already here yesterday at a different webinar, and which is very interesting. For example, certain actors, they tend to focus more on the outcome of a solution of certain problems. They are very solution oriented, while others, like foreign policy practitioners and experts, they focus more on the process. What is it that will take us to the solution? And this, if we learn how to put these perspectives together, we will also be more successful in breaking the silos and working together more effectively, seeing each other's comparative advantages, not really, and also seeing each other more on an equal footing, really seeing how each different person, each different sector can contribute. And of course, the reason why we cannot meet in Stockholm is that unfortunately the whole world is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. But for us, that's not the only crisis that we see. We also see immense economic recession, significant economic downturns in some parts of the world. That is also then paired with environmental degradation, impacts of climate change, and bigger looming crisis. So if we really better communicate together, if we extend the table, we talk to more people, we understand better our context, we also have a better way how to deal with these different crises. And we can be more effective in finding solutions together. And one of the key that we see is really to have a wise leadership when science will come before politics, and when the decision makers will really see how they can use the immense knowledge that's already out there. And I sincerely hope that this webinar is a first step in, or it's not the first webinar on this topic, and I'm sure it's not the last, but for our group, it's the first step in our effort in working more on this issue. And we really do hope that we will see you soon again after this webinar. And I hope that you enjoy discussion and our distinguished panel. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martina, for this introduction. And I would now like to give the floor to a voice from the ground, from one of the actors engaged in transboundary cooperation, but also intersectoral cooperation between different sectors. And this is Anoulak Kittikhoun from the Mekong River Commission. Anoulak, you have the floor.
Thanks, Sonja. Nice to see everyone again. So I will address my talk on the subject of how the Mekong, or in particular the Mekong River Commission, has dealt with transboundary water challenges, including climate change and climate risks. So next. So just first, maybe some of you does not need introduction to the Mekong, but we had a big assessment done, and in terms of developing our new basin development strategy, and we have found that there are sort of 4 or 5 key points or key pressures that any new strategy needs to address. First is that the Mekong, has undergone for the past 5 years, or certainly more, rapid development, economic growth, and that has reduced poverty across the region. In terms of the Mekong itself, in terms of the flow regime, it is no longer a natural river anymore, with increasing storage, both in the upper basin, but also in tributaries of the lower Mekong. So this has resulted, along with climate variability, rapid river level fluctuations are becoming the norm for some parts of the basin. So this is certainly a challenge, especially for the vulnerable groups that are lying along the basin. And pressure on the environment is increasing as a result of development, as in other rivers that have been developed before. You have, signs of fish declining. The Mekong, as you know, is one of the largest, or is the largest inland fisheries resources in the world. Loss of environmental assets, from reduction of floodplains to watersheds to wetlands, etc. And despite economic growth, there's still a lot of poverty in the region, or pockets of poverty, and significant inequalities between different groups in society. And finally, probably the subject of our discussion, climate is changing rapidly, and the Mekong is assessed as being one of the most vulnerable to climate change, both in terms of rising temperature, rising sea level in the delta, meaning more potential floods and droughts in the future. And this has not been following the normal patterns of floods and droughts. Despite this, development still exists. The Mekong is still a developing river, but you know, one of the key role of the MRC and other actors in the basin is to help member countries manage this development. So what is our new strategy? It's, you know, we're talking about breaking silos. So, you know, we have a preface to the strategy. It's called IWRM. So we have, you know, been practicing this concept in the Mekong for some time. So it's still there. IWRM, it means, you know, you cannot just look at the water sector alone, but do it across water related sectors, as well as exogenous factors. And this new strategy tries to be a strategy that guides all actors in the entire basin. And for the first time also, it has a vision that goes beyond economically prosperous, socially just, environmentally sound for the basin, but also climate resilient. So this has been added to the Mekong Basin vision for the first time towards 2040. And next, if you, the new strategy is about over 100 pages, but I summarize in one slide, and you wonder why we wrote 100 and something pages. But it has sort of 5 dimensions with the usual triple bottom line, sustainable development in terms of tackling economic growth, tackling social well-being, tackling environmental protection. But it has also a big section on climate change risk or disaster risk reduction, especially in the context of the basin floods and drought. You know, I come back again. And finally, you know, to support member countries' cooperation, institutional development, procedures, mechanisms, stakeholder engagement, partnerships, and all of that. And under each of these dimensions of the strategy, you know, climate change or addressing aspects of climate change and disasters has been integrated. For example, under environmental protection, we know that the Mekong regime has changed. It's no longer a natural flow regime. So, you know, we are developing, there needs to be new guidelines on minimum flows, on maximum flows, on coordination mechanism in terms of communication when things happen. Under the priority or the dimension on social, there's a greater emphasis on gender and vulnerability approach, meaning that we need to pay particular attention to the people that are most vulnerable because, yeah, the basin has risen in terms of economic development. So there are people who are very resilient, but there are those that are sort of being left behind, and we need to sort of address them through various measures. And under economic growth, you know, the basin still has rooms to develop, but not in the traditional nationally developed sort of plans. So there is a series of activities that are put in place to look at the basin from a holistic perspective, look at sort of impending water security challenges, looking at the needs of environment protection, as well as looking at meeting the needs of energy, of economic growth, of foreign exchange earnings, etc., to come up with a new sort of basin development plan that hopefully would have joint investment projects, including more storage in the basin to deal with future extreme floods, for example. Because in the Mekong, if you know, we have, although storage has increased, it's still below, 15% of the annual discharge. So when a big flood comes, we cannot really manage the basin. And finally, we need to strengthen our monitoring and our forecasting, as well as our coordination of the existing and future infrastructures that are going to be in the basin, from both a development perspective, but also from a risk perspective. This next. So because this is
Sorry, Anoulak. It seems that
yes.
Hannah, that there is a problem with sharing of the screen.
Oh.
Hannah, can you please show the correct slide?
So that would be slide 5.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Go on.
Is it okay? Sorry. Thank you.
Yes, yes. This is the one. Yeah. Yeah. So you know, the strategy takes a holistic, multi-sector and multidisciplinary view, and that's also how we approach this COVID-19 situation. You know, we like to think, and we have written a whole new section in the strategy about responding or supporting member countries' response and recovery from COVID-19 in terms of strengthening economic recovery, strengthening resilient, strengthening sort of mechanisms and measures to deal with water security, improving food security, and I think this cannot be understated, enhancing or maintaining regional cooperation and trust, which is really crucial in times of pandemics and outbreaks and things. So on the right side of the slide, I elaborated some of the activities which we can come back to if we have time. So next, we in addition to our basin-wide strategy in dealing with transboundary challenges and climate issues, we have a very specific also instrument called the Mekong Climate Change Adaptation and Action Plan, or MASAP, we call it for short. And this is, you know, this is a very specific strategy approved by the countries to help them address sort of things that their national determined contribution do not. So aspects have to do with transboundary issues mainly. For example, you know, what Sonja was saying earlier about adaptation measures at national level may not necessarily be optimized from the basin-wide point of view, or may even hurt other countries. So this strategy provides some guidelines on that, as well as building capacity in terms of helping the countries address climate actions at the national level. And finally, it tries to help the country draw sort of international climate finance to address joint challenges. And my final slide is just the next one. It's just some snapshots of what's happening in each country in terms of implementing the MASAP. We have these NDCs, and we look at the NDCs of each country, and we, together with the countries, pick you know, various actions that needs to be sort of relook or re-examine and adapt from a transboundary climate point of view. So for example, in Cambodia, we look at the water sector and subsector development plans, both at the national level and the subnational levels, to ensure that you know, vulnerability to change is sort of well mainstream. And in other countries, we help strengthen information gathering, assessment, data collection, and exchange in terms of sort of climate mainstreaming. So in summary, you know, the Mekong, I think, is lucky to have both a basin-wide development strategy that is sort of climate-proof and a very specific instrument to help countries address transboundary risks in their climate change actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anoulak, for this presentation, which has shown very well how river basin organization can add value by actually taking an intersectoral approach, by bringing countries together, and also by making linkages between the national level, where, for example, the NDCs are currently being developed and revised, and the basin-wide level. I have also seen that there has already been a very engaged discussion in the chat with many questions raised, and I would like to encourage you to continue raising questions and sharing your experiences. We will take them up in the Q&A session later on. In the chat also came up a number of questions related to intersector cooperation and whether water is a sector, but also whether the role of financing it is. And with this, I would like now to give over the floor to our next speaker, who is Anders Jägerskog from the World Bank. Anders, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sonja, and thanks to the speakers. Thanks to everyone who's joining. I'm amazed to see how many are joining. I counted, I saw 135 or something. So that's great. So I don't want to waste your time but rather going straight into it. I mean, intersectoral perspectives and approaches we can talk about for long. Probably we should dedicate a couple of days to that. However, I'd like to point out a few from the World Bank perspective, and I should say that in my work I work mostly on the MENA region, but also in Africa. I'm also the transboundary focal point for the World Bank, but I won't speak only on transboundary. And I'd like to highlight also that we have a number of trust funds working on transboundary water, so happy to engage with people offline on that. I represent in this case also SIWI, the Cooperation on International Waters in Africa, which is the largest trust fund we have as of now supporting transboundary waters. But I'd like to zoom in on a few things that I think are important. We've been talking about, and I've seen in the chat box, I've been trying to respond to some of that. Water a sector? Is that no, it's a connector. We've had the IWRM approach a couple of decades ago. We see that included in the SDGs, including transboundary, which is great. The challenge now is to follow up and make sure that becomes a reality, and we're trying to do our part, but I think everyone needs to work together to make that happen. I'd like to touch upon a few things, maybe 3 or 4 things where I see intersectoral approaches being needed. We've talked maybe in the last decade or so of the water, energy, food nexus. So that's an obvious one where sectors need to work together and move away from their silos. I see a number of other areas as well where we need to have much more of that happening. And I think a number of crises that have happened in the last, say, 5 or 10 years, and also in the last year, in the last half year, have brought that to bear. And I would like to start by what we call in the World Bank the FCV, the fragility, conflict, and violence. And that's not a sector. However, unless we engage with the actors that work on security, perspectives in regions where you have conflicts, the MENA region is a case in point, but also the Africa, and we also have it in other parts of the world. Unless we engage with sectors and rather actors that are engaged there from the water perspective and understand how they work. I'm thinking particularly about the humanitarian actors in relation to the Syria crisis, the situation in the Middle East. We see from the World Bank perspective, and we've developed a strategy to address this, that unless we work with, for example, ICRC or Norwegian Refugee Council or UNICEF, who are already there on the ground working on humanitarian on the humanitarian situation, we will not do our job properly unless we engage with them in the different situations, because most of the conflicts today tend to be protracted. Maybe if we go back 50, 60, 70 years, conflicts were started and then they ended. And then the World Bank came in post-conflict reconstructions. That's not happening as clearly any longer. So that puts the onus on us to start engage much earlier, and maybe throughout a conflict, or in certain conflicts there are pockets of conflict still ongoing, while you can start reconstruction and rebuilding of a country at the same time in other parts. So that's where we are seeing ourselves engaged in much more with humanitarian actors. So that's one perspective. The other perspective, which the COVID-19 situation has brought to bear, is how we need to work in the water sector, if it is a sector indeed, but let's talk more about that, with the health. I don't need to state what everyone knows, but the hand washing is a key to combat COVID-19. And unless, and particularly from a development perspective, which is our focus in the World Bank Group, unless you have water, you don't have the first line of defense in being able to combat this vicious disease. I'd also like to touch upon some of those cross-cutting aspects, as people like to call them, and it was mentioned by a few others as well. Unless we work with more clear gender perspective that cuts across different sectors, but it's also different perspectives in the water sector, but also in other sectors. And unless we take that on board in a much clearer way, we won't be able to overcome the challenges in whatever sector we are, but definitely not when we are trying to reach across the different silos. And the same, I believe, goes for youth. We've seen that in Africa. We see it clearly in the Middle East and North Africa, that unless we engage the young population, the solutions that are brought to bear will not be sustainable and may not be appreciated by all parts of the population. And I think the development community has had perhaps a tendency to not look deep enough on this issue. And I think the onus is again on us to try to do that in our sectors, but also across the sectors, because the youth brings much broader perspectives, whether it's in the use of new technologies or if it's different approaches that we, and I count myself as old here, may not have. Finally, before I stop this intervention, I'm happily to engage also in the question and answer. The private sector and the financing of projects. The World Bank works both with, primarily the IBRD, which I'm part of, works with client countries, and we provide grants and loans to countries. And that will continue. But what we want to try to see, and an approach that we've been working with in the last 5-10 years, is to try to maximize finance for development, meaning that we are trying to maximize the resources being made available, and we are only one part of that with the grants and loans that can be provided. But the private sector needs to come in much more clearly, and I think that's where we should start, and that's also a sector that the water world and whatever cross-cutting cooperation that we are seeing between water, energy, agriculture, food, etc., are engaged in, need to see. And we have a number of tools that can help that. We can decrease the risks of investment in the different countries, and by buying off that risk and basically paying for that risk to allow them to engage much more closer in the different sectors that we're working in. Sonja, I think I stopped there, but happy to engage more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. Thank you for enlarging our view and showing that we need to break silos, also, for example, between the water and health sectors, also between different population groups, by including gender perspectives, by including the youth into discussions, by including the private sector, breaking down the silos between public and private, and also by not forgetting conflict-prone regions. With this, we come to the end of our introductory speakers. And as I said, there was already a very lively discussion in the chat and in the question and answers. So I'm happy now to hand over to Rachael from IWMI, who will moderate the discussion part. Rachael, go ahead.
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Anoulak, Sonja, Hannah, Martina, and Anders for giving us such a fantastic overview and really challenging us to think about what are boundaries, what are sectors, and what we're doing. We know it's something that we work with every day. At the moment, we're working with the Global Commission on Adaptation, and one of their first priorities under the Water Action Track was to bring water into the climate change discussions. We have water discussions, we have climate change discussions. We're not there in enough detail, and yet we know that the impacts of climate change will be most felt through the water sector. It's what we say all the time, but it hasn't got there, which tells us there are sectoral boundaries in many shapes and sizes, even in international discussions. So one of the things this session is the start of a year-long process. And this is very much to do with setting up our chats now and what other questions will be, but we'll also be wanting to engage us to bring in a community of practice to have further discussions about this as we go forward. So then when we maybe hopefully all be together in Stockholm next year, we can really begin to break down even further some of those silos and barriers. So we know that we're looking forward to your questions now. As part of that process of feeding in your ideas, there will be a questionnaire at the end as you leave this session. So we very much want you to feed through those ideas and thoughts. So then we together can look at how we can do this, because this is something that has been affecting us for a long time. Anybody who's working anywhere, whether it's the Middle East, Andes, or the Mekong, those ministries of agriculture versus ministries of water versus ministries of, and then those different needs for the future are something we have to deal with every day. There are a whole set of questions here. I'm going to link the first ones, and it was a challenge to us is that the silos are there are because of competition. It's not because of competition, it's a consequence of the way that we have been working, and that part of that solution is integrated water resources management. And I welcome pushing that back to the panelists, just saying why do you think those sectorial boundaries are there to start with, and what are the consequences, but how can we start to break those down? Panelists? Martina, how about you kicking us off there?
I just would like to add that we need to distinguish between what do we wish to be and how the situation actually is. Because at SIWI, we work a lot in countries that suffer with, from big institutions that were affected by many decades of conflicts. And there we already see so many challenges with actually coming with an integrated approach to these immense challenges that they are facing. So I think that the situational awareness is extremely important, and I think often we have this expert discussion on what's our best case ideal scenario, and we lose a little bit the perspective how actually the situation is on the ground and what should be the next steps. And I think that this is a very good question. For this we really need to look for local ownership. We really need to work with actors on the ground, with the ones who will actually need to adopt these very difficult decisions and compromises. So we as the international community or external actors who are engaged in these processes, we only need to see what kind of tools we can give them. But the ultimate ownership of these how questions, that really needs to be done case by case by every stakeholder that's engaged in this. We can only explain the benefits, for example, of including civil societies, maybe also helping others more marginalized voices, but the actual ownership on the how, that really is done case by case with the individual actors.
And Anders, one of the points put was that the reason why we have silos, it stops us thinking, but because the solution to overcoming this is that water issues, that the solution to many of those water issues are beyond the water community. They're land and water, they're about enabling environments. How much do you think that is, leading on from what Martina is saying, how much do you think bringing other areas of engagement are needed to overcome those barriers?
Okay, thank you, Rachel, for that question. I think this is a core question. I want to take a step back. Often when we look at how we are organized ourselves, the World Bank, the international community, we tend often to organize ourselves a little bit internally, I mean, in silos as well. I mean, I work in the global water practice at the World Bank. We have an energy practice, we have an agricultural practice. For practical purposes, that's often what we tend to do. And also, if you look at the countries we work with, who are our clients and who we try to serve at the best of our capacity, they're also organized in ministries that deal with often, not always, but often with one question. If it might be water, it might be agriculture, who ideally should be together. I think we see in some countries they combine, water, energy, environment. They combine water and agriculture. I think if those structural, if you like, changes could happen, that would be one important way forward. Also, and what we are trying to help countries with is to try to see, what are the benefits from looking at sectors and working much more closer together. And we can bring in, and when we do that, economic analysis and other types of analysis to showcase how a closer collaboration between sectors and across sectors will bring better results. However, these sort of bureaucratic challenges are immense, and I think it's on all of us here and beyond to try to change that. But by bringing out the incentives and the benefits, I think that's an important part where I feel that we can at least contribute a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, so one of the areas that I know that we at IWMI are looking at these days is looking at impact investors, how we can bring sustainable finance into many of these water issues. And what we find in those discussions is we are forced to think much bigger programs than we're used to working in, but also those programs have to be intersectoral and multi-sectoral, because that's where you gain some of those return on investments, and we have to bring in that joined up thinking to realize the impact that those investments are seeking. So I think in many ways we are being challenged from many different areas to think beyond our water sector these days. There are a series of questions coming up for Anoulak on the Mekong Commission. So Anoulak, can I address these today? There are ones, how are companies from different sectors operating in the Mekong Basin, including in the adaptation plan? What does the database of the Mekong Commission entail, and is it fully accessible? And one of the other areas is, in the adaptation and action plan, do you consider different types of storage, dams versus natural infrastructure? And is there a large potential to manage natural infrastructure and its services better? So those are the first three, and look, if you could address those, and then there are a few more to come back to, if that's possible. The Mekong talk will obviously resonated very well with our participants.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, it seems 90% for the Mekong. Maybe I cannot address all of them, but maybe a common theme. So 2 points. One is on this intersectoral collaboration, nexus, etc., and the second one on storage. So the first one, I think, it goes without saying, once you intervene in water, especially transboundary water, it breaks boundaries, it breaks silos already. So for the MRC, one particular example that shows very well how the different ministries, stakeholders work together is our consultation process on a mainstream hydropower project, for example. Before the proposing country, before they submit to the MRC the proposal, the Ministry of Energy would submit to the Ministry of Environment, and the Ministry of Environment would review the documents based on their mandate, which is EIA, etc. And then once the governments agree, they submit to the MRC. And at the MRC, we right away set up an sort of expertise group, which according to our guidelines, you have to look at different aspects, not just the hydrology, but environment, fish, dam safety, navigation, etc. So we are forced by our guidelines to be intersectoral. And then finally, our mechanism that is in place obligates us to consult many different actors, not only the government-like agencies of different countries that are reviewing the project, but also have to go back and forth with the proposing country, as well as their private consultants or the developers. So we have to work with the private sector and to understand, what they're proposing. And then in the midst of all that, we have to consult with the broader stakeholders, which have different levels of capacity in terms of engagement, understanding, knowledge, perception, etc. So in the end, after all of that input, the technical review, the discussions at the broad stakeholder level, the governments come together and negotiate, and they usually bring with them foreign affairs. So you know, the whole process involves very much nexus thinking and intersectoral coordination. So the key, I think, for it to work is you have procedures in place, you have technical guidelines that look at different sectors, and you have a mechanism that obligates you or allows you to consult widely. The second issue is storage. In the Mekong, yeah, it's there's increasing storage, especially in the Lansang Chinese part, as well as in the tributaries. But like I said before, it's up to 15%, right, of annual discharge. So you cannot really manage the basin with this. And some of you ask, well, if we put in more storage, which could mean more dams, would that hurt the environment even more? Could be, right? So this is a big trade-offs that governments and stakeholders need a very clear process to discuss and negotiate. But when you are faced with, say, in the next 5-10 years with a big floods and 20 million people in the Delta are swept away, what do? So there will be demands for protection. And the solution is not always infrastructure, right? So the Mekong has a large floodplains in the delta that, you know, acts as a natural storage. So maybe maintaining that or saving that from development is one crucial trade-off that needs to be made. And look at all options, right? Both infrastructure and non-infrastructure in light.
Hi, I'm lost sound there. Perhaps we have, and look, you could answer the additional questions in the chat after this. I'd like to now take the next question that's been put to Anders, the World Bank. It says, how can green recovery post-COVID-19 encouraged in conflict areas like the MENA region? Is there an issue on the type of financing resources, and what do you think are the priority of some countries to recover economically and faster rather than slow green recovery? Anders, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. That's a very good question. I think what the World Bank tries to do when we're supporting, if it's a project, if it's which is, you know, a larger chunk of financing, but also in smaller projects, we are trying to make sure that all the important aspects relating to, for example, climate change and all the other green aspects are covered. So if we're engaging in a conflict country, it's not that we are sort of throwing all the important imperatives such as you know, safeguards, environmental safeguards and social safeguards abroad. On the contrary, we want to help countries build back better, you know, to use a somewhat of a cliche, but it's true, and we have our systems in place to make sure that that when we're engaging, we actually have to follow those rules. So I wouldn't say that you know, in order to get something going quickly, we throw the safeguards overboard. We don't have the mandate to do that. On the contrary, we are hard pressed for very good reasons to keep those safeguards in place. And this is actually, yeah, it might feel like a pain at some point, but in reality, it's something that will benefit everyone at the end of the day.
And so maybe I could put that to you as well. So in the work with your commission, how are you bringing COVID into these discussions? Is it something that's needing to be brought in, or are those big pictures of changing climate and changing water stresses very much to the fore? Sonja, I welcome your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Rachael. And absolutely, I think the last few months have absolutely shown that we need to bring in also the health sector in discussions, including in discussions on transboundary water management. For example, we had a workshop on developing agreements in July, where we included a session on interrelation between the two topics. Generally, I believe the current situation has, on the one hand, elevated the importance of water, because water is so crucial for addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. But on the other hand, it has also shown the challenges of exactly the need for practical intersectoral cooperation. I believe that, for example, in UNECE, we also have the so-called Protocol on Water and Health, which is a unique instrument bringing together the water, health, and environment sectors, and which is actually asking countries, helping countries also to achieve the human right to water and sanitation by better water management and by preventing water-related diseases. And I believe we could talk much longer about these questions. Maybe some of them could become part of the future webinars, which we're planning to organize in the course of the next year.
And Hannah, could I put that question to you as well? How in your work are you seeing that COVID, climate change, these major stresses are being brought into the discussions, and are they impacting the discussions that you're seeing? Hannah? Are you able to hear me? No, perhaps not.
Are you asking me, Rachael?
Yes, I was, Hannah.
Well, I think Sonja has covered this question from our side, so it's fine.
Okay, that's right. So one of some of the last questions that we see here has: does the MRC develop and implement a capacity building program for stakeholders to help people understand the multidisciplinary dimensions of IWM, including negotiation skills? So maybe some of those negotiation skills that we're talking about here, they're part of that bringing common terminology, bringing actors together from different modalities that Martina spoke about. Anoulak, could you possibly address that?
Yes, thank you, Rachael. We used to do a lot of training and capacity building, especially so 4 or 5 years ago. Increasingly, as we become more of a coordinating river basin organization with more sort of fine core functions, we have less and less sort of more these type of training or capacity building, but in a sense for the countries and their allied agencies, the fact of participating in our assessment, in our studies, in our negotiation, some of these skills are developed. But a specific capacity building program we don't have at the moment.
And Martina, perhaps we could talk about that a little bit in a bigger way. How much of it is that we need through programs such as that of SIWI to be breaking down those terminology barriers, or those different ways of people doing their job that all want the same end, but we come at it from different frameworks of thinking. So I welcome your thoughts on that.
I think, of course, that is our vision. We all strive to do our best in this regard, but often we are facing really difficult situations. We work in some of the most challenging transboundary basins, like the Nile, the Jordan River, Euphrates and Tigris, and often there it's about making one step forward, 2 steps back. So it's really there. We do strive to include different perspectives, and we always try to have a more holistic perspective and engage different sectors. But often it is often quite challenging. But I think that's something that we can do as an external actor. We can also engage a different new group of stakeholders. For example, in the Nile, we work with journalists, where we help to bring them together as the ones who shape opinions. We also have founded, SIWI has founded a network for women, women diplomats in the Nile. So we really do try to open new different boxes when the traditional dialogue is a little bit more difficult at a certain time.
So one question, the last one, maybe this one's to you, Anders. It says, I hear mostly on what we need to do and achieve, but we'll be interested in experiences and successful practice on how to achieve that. So we know that we need to do this. How can we do this? So we welcome your thoughts on that one, Anders.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a very good question, and you're putting me on the spot here, which is fine. We've seen projects. We have projects that are cross-cutting in many regions, and I think what we can see, what is probably commonality for those projects, is that we've started already from the beginning, and that's not only the World Bank starting, it's actually the country starting and asking us, let's do something, for example, in water, energy, and agriculture. So we make sure that we're covering all those bases rather than only do water, do energy, do agriculture as separate projects. So one example would be water energy support that we did for Jordan, because they are intimately connected. Much energy is needed for the water to be pumped wherever it's needed in Jordan. And for those that have been in Jordan, it's very hilly, it's up and down, and the water is not in the place where you need it. So looking at those two together and seeing how Jordan as a country can develop better approaches to make sure that they are achieving most of the synergies that's possible. I'd say that it could of course always be improved, but this is one example of how one can approach this. A small one, but there are many others as well. But I think it needs to come from the countries, because if an institution like mine would come and only tell them, then the ownership will be less. But if it really comes through the countries, I think that's probably the key. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Forgive me for putting you on the spot with such a difficult question. Okay, this has been a fantastic set of interactions. We've loved your questions. And as we said, this is very much part of a whole process. And hopefully we'll all be together in Stockholm next year. So Sonja, I'm handing back to you to close out this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for moderating the discussion. And thank you for all your questions, comments, and contributions. We had a very lively chat. And as Rachel said, it was impossible to answer all, but at least we were able to shed some light and share some experiences and good practices. Just 2 or 3 quick conclusions. I would like to say from the discussion we had that we need to look beyond the water sector, but in order to do that, we need to broaden our horizon. And we also need to actually consider what's in it for the other sectors to come on board. What is the water energy sector, for example, interested in? In order to start a dialogue, we need to try to take their language, as Martina said at the beginning, to put ourselves in their shoes. We also there are many barriers to intersectoral cooperation, such as institutional boundaries, political ones, technical ones, but we can overcome them, for example, also by institutional solutions, by establishing intersectoral committees, by looking at innovative technical solutions, some of which were proposed here, and by considering green and gray infrastructure. Finally, as it was said, this is just the start of the discussion. We're planning to do additional webinars, and we hope to see you, to keep you engaged in the discussion. You can submit as of November abstracts for the sessions at the World Water Week 2021, and we will upload the presentations and conclusion of the seminar on the website. Finally, I would like to thank everybody involved in this seminar, the colleagues, the speakers, the co-conveners, the scientific program committee, the technical staff who helped organize the session, and all you, the audience, for your questions and interactions. And let's stay in touch and stay engaged over the coming weeks, because only together, by working together across sectors and boundaries, we will be more strong in addressing the multiple crises, climate change, health crisis, and many others. Thank you very much, and have a good day, and stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.